I first became involved when Lauren Williams took me to the number 63 at the Western Railroad Museum. That was an original Petaluma trolley. This is it right here. I took this picture and I looked at that and I said, oh my God, that's just a floating chariot of American craftsmanship, and it's belonged to the PNSR, the Petaluma trolley, Petaluma Santa Rosa Railroad. It was in the Western Railroad Museum in Sassoon, and I thought, well, how come nobody understands or knows very much about the history of railroads in Petaluma? It's a big deal. It has everything to do with the river, our central hub, the turning basin, the trestle, the economy that built the beautiful buildings that are all around the city. So I became interested in the railroad history. Because I was president of Heritage Homes at the time, Paul Marangella called me into his office, and he had been making newspaper comments about how the trestle was too old and had to be torn down. And me being the representative of the preservation organization in town, he said, well, Chris, why don't you just say it's okay and we'll take it down? And I thought, well, you know, if it really is gone, it should probably come down, right, if you can't save it. But there were some things that were kind of strange about how I didn't feel real comfortable about it. I thought if I were going to do that, I'd have to check with some other engineers and get some attitudes. Paul was saying it just has to come down. And I checked with other engineers, and they would first want to know who I was and what my questions were and why I was asking them before they'd give me an answer. And I thought that was kind of suspicious. When I got away from local engineers, they said, well, yeah, there's trestles all over America. There's wooden trestles, there's thousands of them in the United States. Wooden trestles don't have to be torn down. And it's not true what Paul said, that no civil engineer would put his stamp on a wooden trestle. So I started becoming more involved and paying a little bit more attention to what was going on. And it occurred to me that what we needed is a historic structural analysis of the trestle. And I talked to Pam Torliette and said, how are we going to do this? Have you got any money in the registers there? And she said, yeah, there's $80,000. Why don't you propose it at a council meeting? And I did, and everybody said, oh, that sounds really good, let's do it. So we got the money and we got the HSR, but of course, Paul wasn't moving on that very fast. It took a little prodding. But when we did get the HSR, it showed that not only could the trestle be saved, but it was historic, and it had only two major faults, and they're the most visible ones. One is where the tide goes up and down, those pilings have little animals, you know, living in them and eating away at them, but right below the mud line, it's aerobic. So the piles are good from right below the mud line to bedrock. And if you were to fix or be able to fix those pilings, then you could support the trestle and it would be fine. Except for the aspect of the deck, and that's the other ugly aspect. Now, the deck itself is primarily about, and when it was originally built, was 3-inch boards by 10 and 12 planks, and going along with the tracks. And the reason for that, at the level of the tracks, and the reason for that is that there were hand carts and trucks going back and forth over the tracks, and the tracks would have been an obstacle. So restoring the trestle to its original condition is even more historic than we had thought it might be able to be. This is a copy of the cost out that the HSR said it would cost to rebuild the trestle. And it came up to a total of $2 million. 50% had added to the cost of the building of the trestle just so it wouldn't be underestimated. And it called for a number of different things, but primarily it called for simply putting a cement block around the pilings, isolating the pilings from any further damage, and putting a deck on it. And then we got the grant. The city pursued and got the grant from the Coastal Conservancy because it's right in their wheelhouse. It shows a connection that the city has with the river, and it shows the accessibility that would be maintained so that people would pay attention and consider their waterways to be a tremendous asset. It was $500,000. We thought it was a big success and everything would be fine, and the city said, well, I tell you what, we'll handle the grant. And so when the city took over, I said, that sounds like fine to me, because the problem was I was really busy and I was making a living and I was trying to, survive. And if the city can take over the grant, now we've got the job is done. But then a whole bunch of complicated situations started to unfold. And when the city made the presentation of the three alternatives that it was going to present, one of them, the first alternative, was actually everybody thought it was ugly. It was described as ugly by them. Now, why would you create an alternative that was actually ugly? It's not an alternative. And it was a mishmash of the first idea of slicing and splicing the piles. It used different configurations, and the whole thing looked just completely ridiculous. The second alternative that the city engineers, Winslow and Kelly, came up with was to put screw piles in between each bent. Now, by definition, the bent, this is one bent. So maybe we'll go into the description of some of the elements of the trestle. This is actually the city's drawing of what they proposed for most of the bents. Here you splice. Here's the new pile. This is called a bent cap. These are the stringers. These are the rails. And this is the deck. And this would be a solution that would be just fine. But they kept on putting screw piles and more screw piles in some of their, and this is screw piles in between each bent to support the bent and let the rest of the trestle bents deteriorate right there. I mean, that's ugly. That is ugly. And their third alternative was to tear it down and rebuild it. Rebuild it in steel, non-historic materials. So everybody was just, oh my God, I've got to get out of here. And everybody who had signed up to be part of the focus group to help alternatives, they just were sick and they left. But they all signed up, and I have their list of their numbers. But the presentation was so disastrous that nobody wanted to be involved anymore. Now imagine that, getting a grant to save a trestle and using that grant to say you had to tear it down. By the way, when they said they could tear it down and rebuild it, when some people say, well, just, tear it down and be done with it because it's such an eyesore. But they never considered the fact that if you did tear it down, there's a 90-degree bend right there and in the river, and the trestle actually protects the bank. So if you tore down the trestle and paid, it was estimated 10 years ago that it would cost $300,000 to tear down the trestle, and an extra cost because you'd have to sheet pile the entire bank where the trestle used to be. And there goes your history. Well, they were saying that it really can't take the load, and that we would have to do these strange things to it in order to make it take the load. Well, and particularly the thing that couldn't take the load, according to them, was an area that they designated as a global failure area. They called it a global failure because some of the pilings, some of the bents had been moved slightly because the mill had pushed the mill was sinking in a little bit, and it had pushed some of the retaining wall forward, and which wasn't very good, not much of a retaining wall. So there was some bents that had been slightly moved towards the river. And you can see that there's a curve in the tracks. So when the mill was becoming active, they said, oh my God, we're going to have to take care of this. And so they drove, I don't know, it was 15 or 18 pilings into bedrock that were cement reinforced, rebuilt the retaining wall, and that became a non-issue. So at this time, I think it would be good to show you part of what we're trying to do. It turns out that a pedestrian load, because we had considered putting maybe a trolley across it for demonstration purposes at some time, but a pedestrian load is heavier than a trolley load. And what we're asking to, when we save this trestle, what we're asking it to handle is a pedestrian load. And then people say, well, we need these screw piles to support it. Well, they don't need them, because if you watch this video and you see the Cal Northern train coming right across the trestle. I think that's 92, 94, 92. You can tell this is two 80-ton diesels and a 40-ton hopper. That's 200 tons. And what we wanted the trestle to hold was 30 tons. That's equivalent. That's what if it were a trolley. And a pedestrian load is slightly more than that, but it's more distributed. So there's no question that this trestle, with its new spliced pilings, could support, it could actually support full rail, which is what it was designed for, but we're only asking it to support pedestrian load. Now, these right here are stringers, and the trestle is 500 feet long, and these stringers run under the rails, and they're supported by the bend cap. Bend cap is about a 14 by 14 beam, they've all been determined by the structural analysis, and all of these members are good. The only thing that's failing is right here. So you splice this and put a new piling on top, and then you put a new deck, and the problem is solved. So in the estimates, the HSR, the Historic Structure Report, with a 50% contingency, would be a 1.2 million cost. And in fact, many of the items that the HSR called for have already been accomplished. And they are geotech studies, timber studies, and obtaining all of the permits and all of the regulatory agencies to say that it was okay to rebuild the trestle. That's a small point, let me point that out. People say, well, who owns the trestle? And, oh, it belongs to SMART, it's common thought. But the trestle itself is a right-of-way. A right-of-way is owned by the public. It's managed by SMART. And they have abandoned that spur, it's called the Western Spur, and they are in some economic binds themselves, so they don't have much money to put into the situation. Anyway, they have no, what you might describe as horse in this race, because it is for Petaluma. And maybe that's a good time to point out some things. When the city of Petaluma applied for the grant from the Coastal Conservancy, they had to lay a pretty strong case for the Coastal Conservancy to come and design this trestle for them. And it's called authorizing resolutions. And all of this information that I have is derived basically from the city goals and presentations and analysis presented to the council. The trestle accomplishes so many different goals. So it has to do with the bicycle and pedestrian plan, the historic district guidelines, the river access and enhancement plan, their policies, the Secretary of Interior standards, the general plan, all of these specific items that back up, this will accomplish everything that we have been saying we'd like to do. And even the community goals and setting goals workshop is filled with all kinds of references to how good it would be to save the trestle. And I made this little chart myself because there were so many people saying, well, the trestle is just for the trolley, we don't need it. But it increases tourism dollar, creates and keeps sustaining jobs for our downtown. It inspires economic development, supports downtown business, improves civic and pride and identity, improves pollution awareness, because a portion of the deck of the trestle would be around the culvert, which would show that what people put in the streets goes right into the river. Sustain the community goals, improves Petaluma River identity, removes blight from the river town, improves or maintain history, identity, maritime history, preserves cultural history, it's a landmark, California Railroad history, etc. You know, I'm not even at the end of the page. It's definitely something that is worthwhile doing. So I commissioned Nettsburg and Brighton to do this visual of how the trestle would look when it was restored. You'd have all of this deck area that we know now is so valuable to restaurants and to events. It would have farm-to-table markets. So the other thing to do to show how that what we used to have here is when we had river festivals, you could see how many people loved and used that area. The trestle itself, the trestle deck area being 500 feet long and approximately varying from 12 to 25 and even longer feet wide, would add 10,000 square feet of downtown usable, historic, significant pride to our town. So those are the ways that I have been trying to, through the past couple of years, point out the significance. Now that you see what the city can do in a presentation, here's an example of what the cost happened to the cost of the trestle when the city got a hold of doing the estimating. They put screw piles in, which means that the trestle would have to be completely removed, portions of it, and then replaced wherever you put screw piles in. Now screw piles are torque, they call them torque piles, that go into the ground and all the way down to bedrock, and so you won't have to do any piling. But it destroys the historic value to put a steel piling in when it's completely unnecessary. So here's where the city started to get the grant, and their first estimate was 3.4 million, and then Alt A was 3.5, and then Alt 1B was 3.8, and then Alt the GHG said it was 4 million, and then they generally now say, oh, it's going to cost $5 million. But that is really not true, because this here is the estimate that the trestle would actually cost if, under the city plans, if the entire trestle was treated with splice and replace piles and put a new deck on it. But there's a certain area that they call the global failure area. This chart shows how if you took out the use of screw piles, which are totally unnecessary, because we're only handling 1/10 the weight that the trestle was originally designed to hold, and put in the way the rest of the trestle had been designed in its final designs, you save a couple of $1 million. It comes down to $2,589,000. The other aspect is that the city claimed that there was no possibility of having a grant to help them rebuild the trestle. Well, the fact is that the original grant that they obtained, I found out later, I didn't know at the time, was a two-stage grant. The first grant was for drawings, and the second stage would be a matching funds for rebuilding. And it so happens right now that Coastal Conservancy, if that trestle were designed properly, would be, is getting most likely refunded, and they would love to take this, what would otherwise be lost investment, and turn it into a positive investment. In other words, this would be a good deal for the Coastal Conservancy. And that would bring this down to here. So, and quite often people say, well, you know, if you tear out the trestle and take it down to the dumps as #2 hazardous waste, and sheet pile the other side, that's going to cost more than if nobody's going to help you with that grant. And so, that would be burden to the cost of the entire city, and it would be like a scar. It hurts. A scar where it could have been saved and they didn't. Now that we have a very potential new majority on the city council, you're going to find out that some of the previous administration's work can be fixed, and that's our next move, and that's what we're going to try and do.